this tradition we have at this stage of having a lecture in advance of the AGM. And I'm particularly delighted this year to introduce Kieran Rose as our guest speaker. I heard many months ago from Ed Penrose, first of all, apologies from Ed today. Both himself and his wife got COVID and have been handing it back and forth to each other, so he's not here. But Ed told me that Kieran had dropped in a kind of a manuscript copy of your memoir of the trade union movement and the struggle for gay rights. And then I said, well, that's now a great thing to have, and I wonder could we tie it in with AGM lecture. And then Forza, our own union, decided to print it in a kind of a much more respectable format, if I can put it like that, in the context of launching the LGBT network within the union. And there was a lovely event in the Forza office, again, a little while ago. And we followed it up anyway with an invitation to this. Very often, the whole kind of, let's say, story in history is from the top down. So, like, you know, even Labour historians will tend to criticise kind of big national history as ignoring the Labour movement. But ourselves, actually, we're as bad, because very often we tell the story of trade unions or political organisations from the point of view of the head office and, you know, the central records and all of that. And it's actually quite rare to have a story from somebody who didn't hold high office but was extremely influential within an organisation. And I think that's the huge value of this story to be fed into the Labour History Society and the wider kind of social movements and social struggles. So with that, I'll hand over to Kieran. The way we'll do it is he'll talk for 20-25 minutes, take us through the slideshow, and then we'll have time for Q&A, and the AGM proper will commence around 12ish. Obviously, we'll let this conversation go as far as it gets.
Okay, thanks very much, Shay, and thanks very much for the invite here today, because it's a great honour. I mean, the Irish Labour History Society is a very august, I think, organisation. It has done huge work, and in fact, I used when I was in the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network in the like late 80s and in the 90s. I remember reading Sater and as a way of learning about how social movements operate, the problems they have, and how they have to think out their strategies and stuff like that. So my engagement with Sater and with the Irish Labour History Society goes back to then. One of the really important things, I think, is that the role of the very important role of the trade union movement in making progress for LGBT people is not really recognised much in Ireland, and so I thought it was really important that we should begin to kind of develop the story and the narrative and the understanding of the role of the trade unions in the huge transformation in Irish society for LGBT people since like the 70s and the 80s. So the story in terms of trade union engagement kind of begins more or less in 1981. There was the first National Gay Conference was held in Cork in the fabulous offices of what was then the LGBTQ Connolly Hall. And one of the workshops we had at that was on the trade unions, and there was the beginnings of setting out the objectives and the goals that we would work on for the next decade or more. And one of the things which was kind of, you know, the story of the trade union movement and LGBT people is good, but there are parts of it where obviously the trade unions weren't all brilliant all the time. So IFET, the Irish Federation of University Teachers, must be in 1980 or whatever, they passed a motion put forward by David Norris, and the motion said, bring this motion on gay rights through ICTU. And then IFET decided, the IFET executive decided that no, they weren't going to do that, and they didn't. So after our conference, the ICTU came down to City Hall in Cork for their conference, and so we kind of picketed it and or lobbied it, saying, you know, that you should have a lesbian and gay motion before you. And just it's kind of interesting. That's Laurie Steele. He's from Australia. He was a gay activist in Australia, and they were attacked by the police on a particular parade or march or whatever and arrested. So once he was released, he scooted off to London and met Arthur Leahy, and they came back to Cork. So when I was in the LGBTQ at that stage, working in Cork County Council, and I put a motion to the local Cork branch in 1982, and then that was passed overwhelmingly. It went on to the national meeting, AGM of the union, and it got really good coverage. It got passed, I would say, and got really good coverage in all of the newspapers and radio and television and stuff like that, which we gay people at the time didn't get that kind of positive publicity. So it was really important. And Tom Bogue was the president of the LGBTQ at that particular time. I worked with Tom in Cork County Council, and he was a huge supporter. Unfortunately, Tom has passed on. That's Laurie Steele again up there on the top left. And I've included that photograph because so much of these slides and almost our experience in the 80s was that we were on marches all the time, it seemed. And that meeting was nearly all the time. And sometimes one meeting would follow another meeting, you go along to another campaign meeting. So I just thought it was important that we had fun too. And so that's us in, I think it's Slay Head, outside a cottage that we had rented. So we had good times. But and on the other hand, of course, like there were so many campaigns. The 80s were an awful time in one way, you could say. But it, that's not the full story. But that's the anti-amendment campaign, which went on for ages, because the campaign wasn't just when the referendum was called. The campaign was about even trying to stop the referendum being called. And the trade unions, of course, were very important in that anti-amendment campaign. There was the trade unionists against the amendment group. And the 80s, one of the awful things about the 80s what was the very high levels of unemployment and of emigration. And one of the things the Cork Gay Collective did was we were involved in the setting up of a workers' cooperative, the Key Co-op Cork, which is still there. And that was hugely important for a number of reasons. One, because of high unemployment, people often couldn't join unions. So the people there was a cafe and a restaurant, so they joined Oidatu. So that allowed the people in the Key Co-op in Oidatu to campaign within their union. And this kind of thing resulted in an article by Donald Sheehan in the Oidatu magazine. And John Mitchell was the General Secretary at the time, and he was hugely supportive of us. And I suppose like another aspect of the awfulness of the 80s was the killing of Declan Flynn. Thanks very much, Bill. Declan Flynn and the freeing of the killers by the courts. And so there was a famous Fairview March, which in a sense was the first time that LGBT people fought back publicly in Ireland. And in a lot of ways you could say that it was Ireland's Stonewall. So we all came up from Cork as the Cork Gay Collective band there to take part in the march. So, when the lesbians and gay men in the early 70s, early 80s were under huge pressure, and we had very, very few supporters. And the crucial, powerful supporters was the Labour movement, and I included in that the Labour Party, but also the trade unions. The other aspect of the 80s, the incredible pressure that gay people were under was the scourge of HIV and AIDS. And in 1985, Gay Health Action was set up, and that's the photograph. There's Bill Foley, who's here today. Bill is there, and Joan O'Shea again from IDATU. And one of the worst aspects of the HIV/AIDS crisis was that it was used by the state and by right-wingers in the state and outside the state to attack gay people, basically. So Gay Health Action got about £800 to produce a leaflet, and then that funding was stopped. And the funding was stopped because it was contrary to public policy to fund a project, basically, that would advise gay men on safer sex. But the really interesting thing is that Gay Health Action had a social employment scheme. And at the time, that was those schemes were agreed on a tripartite basis between the civil service, the employers and the unions. And having got the Department of Health to stop funding Gay Health Action, the civil service, and I'm sure, knowing the masterminds of the right and all that, there were some Knights of Columbanus operating in the civil service, and they tried to stop the funding for the social employment scheme for Gay Health Action, and the trade union strongly opposed that. And Bertie Ahern, fair dues to him, was the minister at the time, and he paused the meeting, called his civil servants aside and said, "Come off it, you can't be opposing funding a social employment scheme." So it was the trade union support was very theoretical or strategic, and in terms of, but it was also incredibly practical like that, maintaining the social employment scheme. So it too passed their motion supporting lesbian and gay rights in 1982, and then we had to work to get action done on that, and there was some kind of delaying tactics and pussyfooting around by people, including the General Secretary at the time, and people like Phil Flynn and Kevin O'Driscoll and John Mitchell were crucially important in pushing it to take action. And so finally in 1987 that incredibly radical document was produced, policy on lesbian and gay rights in the workplace and in wider society. And that was the first time that any major organisation in Ireland came out so wholeheartedly in favour of equality for lesbians and gay men. And then it led to a huge range of changes and progress. And this is, I think this is a crucial one, is the Labour Party Equal Status Bill of 1990, which is the forerunner of the equality legislation we have today. It says equal status, but it was employment equality and equal status inside the same bill, and it had all the grounds that we currently have to be protected, including sexual orientation. And so one of our crucial aims was equality legislation, but also the issue of unfair dismissals. And Christopher Robson, who was in Upchecks at the time, and I remember him saying that we put probably more effort into getting two words, sexual orientation, into the Unfair Dismissals Act as we did into getting gay law reform. And so that's an example of the various documents we produced. And this one, I think it's a kind of the Glen and the lesbian and gay movement in Ireland in general had a, perhaps I think unusually internationally, it had a kind of a focus on not just on gay law reform or those kind of issues, but also on social and economic progress. And we got funding from the Combat Poverty Agency to do that. Christopher Robson was a key activist in a whole range of areas, but particularly in the area of the trade unions. And in 1988, using the ITU guidelines as a policy framework, they negotiated an agreement with the Department of Finance on equality in terms of sexual orientation and also HIV AIDS status. So that was a phenomenal progress delivered by Christopher, Tom Lacey and the union. So the progress that the trade unions have been involved in goes from gay law reform 1993 on the basis of equality, fair dismissals, equality legislation in the 1990s, civil partnership in 2010, and then they played a very, very important role in the marriage referendum in 2015, including there was no impact at that time, and there was a network of trade unions who campaigned for a yes vote. And just an international dimension to it, and I think it's a fascinating story of that particular maritime union in the United States in the 1930s and 40s, and that's their slogan. They were anti-racist and pro-lesbian and gay, no rape baiting, no race baiting, no queen baiting. And there's a brilliant illustrated lecture by Alu Berube, which you can find on the internet. And of course, it's fascinating. The kind of that thing about Irish history, that a lot of our history, and from Sager as well, you can see it, is in Australia or Britain or the United States. And of course, there was an Irish American gay guy who featured very strongly as an activist in that particular union. So I was in Cork, I'm from Cork and lived in Cork. I was involved with the Cork Gay Collective for up to about 1985 when I came up to Dublin. But we seem to spend a lot of our time travelling up and down to Dublin to meetings and marches and so on. And that's from 1984, and we're on our way up to Dublin to a gay pride parade. And so just bringing my talk to a conclusion and up to date, that was the Forza group on the march, the gay pride, LGBT pride last year. And I suppose this is a really important thing here. At 2015, after the marriage referendum success, and I think an awful lot of people thought, oh, that's great now, done and dusted, there's no going back. But of course, the right, far right in Ireland started attacking the LGBT community in the way of harassing librarians, library staff, for having LGBT related books and magazines in their libraries. And so it's the support of Forza now for the libraries and for protecting LGBT material in libraries is hugely important. So that's it. That's these three geezers or Jews, whatever you want to say. That was at the Forza launch of both the booklet and of the Forza network. That's Arthur Lee, the famous Arthur Lee in Cork, myself, and Colin Kerrigan, equally also from Cork. And just to for those of you who are interested in Labour Party history, Colin Kerrigan's father was Pat Kerrigan, who was a Labour TD in Cork in the 1970s. And actually, just to go back a bit to the fact that we had our first National Gay Conference in Connolly Hall, Cork, and that was crucially important. Again, it's very practical details, is that it was very difficult to get a hotel or a meeting room for an LGBT event in those days. You know, you get it, and then they'd find out that it was a gay event, and suddenly it would be cancelled. So it's crucially important that trade union connection and getting their premises. And Ger Philpott was one of the Cork Gay Collective people, and guess what? Charlie Philpott was his father and was the head of ITGWU in Cork. So we gained for those family connections. That's it. Thanks very much.
Okay, we'll open it to the floor in a minute, but there were two names that were mentioned there, and I just want to maybe flesh out a little bit. First of all, Chris Robson was mentioned, and Bill is here, and I'm delighted about that. The Impact Union was made up of an amalgamation of three unions. There was the UPTCS, Professional and Technical Civil Servants, if we can call it my parish. There was the Local Government and Public Services Union, Kieran's parish, and the third leg of the table was the Municipal Employees Union. And Chris Robson was an activist within UPTCS. He was an unusual character in the sense that he was an architect who worked in the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture didn't tend to have people like that, but I think he was loaned by the Board of Works, and the Department of Agriculture had loads of property and buildings all over the country, and Chris had a run of it. And was an extremely, I suppose, popular individual, but it really shows how individuals can make a difference. Because the advantage that UPTCS and civil service unions had then, and in truth now, is that you're negotiating directly with the Department of Finance or Public Expenditure. And if a policy line is agreed there, it will spread through the rest of the public service and probably into the community and voluntary sector, and is a headline for the private sector. And Chris and the union official Tom Lacey took on the issue, which was hanging out of those policy lines that Kieran spoke about, and got that policy document agreed. And in truth, it was life-changing. It was psychologically important, but in practical terms, the civil service agreed that special provision would be made outside the sick leave regime for anybody with HIV/AIDS. And in truth, there were very few places in the world that had agreed to that. So I think in hearing Kieran's story, I will always see Chris Robson as part of that storyline as well. And the other one, the colleague from Cork City Council, Tom Bogue, who kind of, let's say, as Tom would have done, put out his arms and embraced the campaign and the cause. Tom has a great connection with this building. There's some of Tom's archive is here. Tom left a lot of papers and records from the local government days, and that's here. But another unsung but enormously influential thing that Tom did was, and the Cork branch, was they got the local government union to agree that 3% of the union subscriptions would be earmarked and devoted entirely to international development work. And I don't believe there's a trade union anywhere in the world that has such a funding mechanism. And that was carried from the LGBTQ into Impact, and was carried from Impact into Forza. And in practical terms, what that means is over €750,000 per annum is entirely earmarked for projects of that nature, and leading it back. And some of them have been to support gay and lesbian issues in countries that probably have much bigger challenges than we have in Ireland. And that's not to downplay the challenges and the struggle that Kieran has spoken about. So having said that and paid homage in a small way to both Chris and Tom, I'll open this to the floor for either questions or comments or observations. Over to you. If you'd like to sit down here rather than have to stand.
Just to say that in the booklet, the HIV/AIDS agreement that Christopher and Tom Lacey negotiated is in the appendix. It's there. And I always think that Christopher was very robust in his discussions and stuff like that. And there's a phrase in it that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation will not be tolerated in the civil service. And I always think that Chris wrote that because it sounds terribly like Chris. It's not civil service language. And the kind of fascinating thing is that at the time we were criminalised. The state was still defending the anti-gay laws of Europe and refusing to change the law. Meanwhile, it was saying discrimination would not be tolerated. So it was quite an achievement by the two of them and the union.
Absolutely. No.
I was an official of the INTO in 2004 when our INTO LGBT group was established, and I was involved as a kind of a contact person for that. Because I suppose one thing in the civil service, to be campaigning publicly on gay and lesbian rights, but in schools which were church managed, where 90% of them were managed by Catholic priests under the Catholic Church, people were extremely nervous. And I remember the night of the inaugural meeting of that group, it was in what used to be Jury's Hotel at the bottom of Parnell Square, and it was kind of a darkened room situation. That people got to know about it because we in the INTO put a piece up on the website, and you basically emailed if you thought you wanted to come to the meeting. No names were distributed to anybody about who was coming. So again, when you look at individuals, there was a teacher from Kerry called Sheila Crowley, who became a huge leader of that group, teaching principal in a small rural school in Kerry, and she fronted that group for a number of years. And they were involved in all kinds of campaigns, including a piece about Section 37 of the Employment Equality Act, which effectively, on the face of it, gave an exemption to schools, to religious-run schools, in respect of discrimination, and they were very effective in that, and they're still running a competition in schools called Different Families Same Love. They run it annually to portray that there are different types of families in our society, but it took a lot of courage from those people, but it became quite, as it did in your own union, public service unions, it became quite a trade union issue, and a number of INTO officials took up the cudgels over the years in that regard. But it was a very similar experience. A bit later, they're celebrating their 21st anniversary this year, but it was a different experience. People around that time, the 1980s, were looking at the Eileen Flynn case, as to what church school management could do to you if you stepped out of line. Now, I think, those days are thankfully behind us, and there's no difficulty now with the IIT LGBT group marching on the Pride March and so on. But, a similar experience, I suppose, a little bit later than yourselves, Kieran.
Anyone? Yes?
Can I ask you, Kieran, you mentioned at the very start about iFoot and David Norris bringing the motion, and then the executive, I presume, of iFoot declining to bring that forward to was resistance within the trade unions a feature of all this time? I mean, you give the unions an awful lot of credit for the progress that was made, but were there internal battles within those unions with people with Catholic convictions wanting the unions to stay distant from the movement?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin O'Driscoll, was a crucial supporter of us in LGBTQ, and I remember him saying to me how any time the union came out publicly, like on the Examiner, that kind of report, that he'd get telephone calls from union members saying they were resigning because of what the union was supporting. And there's again, it's in the book. There's a very funny report in the Cork Examiner, because there was in the LGBTQ at the time the Limerick delegates were famously reactionary, you might put it, and one of them, they spoke very strongly. There was three of them, and they spoke very strongly against the gay motion. And
these were delegates in the LPGU.
Yeah, and one of them.
It wasn't just in the 1980s. No, it was just Limerick. It was a strain in the Limerick part of the union.
But one of them said, if Cork have problems with homosexuality, they should go away and sort it out quietly among themselves, rather than involving the union. There you go. And there was the classic one of, the 1982 was the adoption of the ICTU motion. And it wasn't until 1987 that something happened. Well, okay, 1985 a seminar was held, and then, after the seminar and the recommendations, then it had, more pushing and shoving had to take place. So amongst the kind of more like trade union officials, I'm not too sure if it was outright opposition, but it was often delaying tactics, and kind of like trying to push the thing away and stuff like that. And it took people like, Phil Flynn, Kevin O'Driscoll, and John Mitchell, pushing very strongly. It's very funny. John Mitchell, as we all know, was a very abrasive party. He didn't take prisoners. So like there was an argy-bargy between him and the General Secretary at the time was Donal Neville. And Donal seemed to me to be a bit more of a bureaucrat.
He was a Limerick man.
Oh! There's a team with poor old Limerick. So there was foot drag. There was a sense, like from the Limerick people and more generally, was that it was like men in trade unions felt that any discussion about women's issues or about international issues or about gay issues, none of those were trade union issues, because unless you were talking and advocating for men's issues in the trade union movement, you weren't relevant. So like equality for women or equal pay or whatever that for a certain group of trade union members that was not core business.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe they were attendees of the Redemptorists on a regular basis. I don't know. On that though, I mean, I talked in this busy then, I can recall from NUJ days, the pressure in the issue of abortion almost cleaved the union apart.
Yeah.
And the same issue would have arisen for me in CPSU, where routinely motions along the lines of what we're talking about will come up for conference, and there will be a rump in the union articulating against political positions being adopted. Right, we're here to represent paying conditions. What are you on about? Fast forward to today, because correctly we're celebrating success, but we are now again at a place where there is pressure in society, and you can see it in certain political leaders beginning to shift to try and respond to what they see as a reactionary tone in the electorate. What challenges are there for us, and how are you, for instance, prepared in the LGBT community in terms of resisting that shift away from where we've got to, the real danger of pushing backwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a very serious issue. There's the attacks on the libraries, for example,
Exactly.
and now there's a kind of a rowing back on progress for transgender people. That there is a kind of a feeling that the transgender people got too much. You know what I mean? Ooh, let's take something back from them, and I think that is kind of crucial, for events like here today, to see where we have come from, the LGBT community, and how important the support of the trade unions was. And I think the trade unions, like the defending the libraries, forces and stuff like that, will be hugely important in the future. And, that decision from the court in Britain about facilities for transgender people, that would become a work-based issue, in terms of toilets or whatever, So the support of the trade union movement will be crucial, and I suppose there's now this whole need to renew that, and it's hugely important that that force have an LGBT network that's supported by the trade union. You know what I mean? As that is part of its structures, and I think every union should have that kind of support for their LGBT members, not leaving it up to the LGBT members to do their own work and and fundraise for things and stuff like that. But that it should be core business.
Where are the issues?
Thanks. Thank you, Kieran. That was so interesting. Just three observations and just a question. Number one, I was struck what you said at the beginning about instrumental response, but how you found Sarah very valuable in terms of looking at the history of social movements and social change. So I'm delighted to hear that, because that's exactly one of the many objectives associated with it. And then the other point you made about there were so few places to have public meetings on the challenging social issues, whether it was abortion or whatever, or contraception or gay rights. And I think that's really important that, you can see how open the trade union space is. Not all of them, of course, as you said, but how open they've been. So a little bit of self-promotion here. We're delighted that Kieran is going to be speaking in the Sip2 Dan Shaw Centre in Navan under the main council of trade unions at the Navan Pride Week in June. So little, I would see the utility of that is we're given a space for a discussion for the community, for the wider community, but also bringing people into trade union spaces. That they see this is what trade unions do now, that they have social justice and equality at the heart of their mission. I think the last slide you had as well there about the defending the public space, the role of the unions in defending the public space against this right-wing rhetoric and thuggery and extremism. And I think that's going to be that's unfortunately we're all going to have to be mobilised around that as the current crisis rolls on. But so the question I wanted to ask you was, and I didn't get a chance to read your booklet yet, but I will before you come out to Navan. You didn't mention in your speech about an international trade union dimension that you might have drawn upon. I know that has always been a very important dimension of trade union struggles. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? If you did go to the European Trade Union Confederation, or you liaised with even British unions or whatever?
The British UK unions were crucially important for us. NALGO, I don't know if it still exists, the national, it's equivalent to the LGBTQ in Britain, and they were far more advanced than us, obviously. And so we used their kind of material, their publicity material and all that kind of stuff. So, I was sent by the LGBTQ over to a NALGO lesbian and gay conference. So those things were crucially important, all right. Not much wider than that, because we would have had in the 1980s we would have the gay movement would have very little money, very few activists, true. The kind of the numbers of people involved were in the tens, of the kind of strong activists. And a weird thing too that happened, and it happened for the women's movement, was that there was a decline in activism and activists through the 80s. There was a whole series of defeats that disempowered people and kind of depressed people. There was emigration, and I think that there was in 1983 that there was murders of gay men. The Supreme Court said it was right that we should be criminalised. The abortion amendment was passed. Then later in the 80s you had the divorce referendum defeated. So it was a kind of sometimes people think defeats mobilise people, or they don't. Defeats demobilise people, and the opposite is true too. Success emboldens people. I'm wondering now.
Purchase.
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, Kenny, Limerick also
Yeah,
produced Jim Kenny,
Yes, absolutely.
and was elected many times by the people of Limerick. So I just make that point because I think it's important that I'm not from Limerick, but nevertheless they deserve
It's called the devil's advocate.
they deserve credit for that.
But I think the point about the reactionary shift that is taking place, less obvious here at the moment, is not to mean that it's not potentially there. I mean, the far right did quite badly in the European, in the local elections and in the general election. In my view, it doesn't mean that they've gone away, and I think that it's necessary for the sort of the political left and the trade union movement to constantly argue for equality, and everything that all the demands are based on citizenship, equality. Because otherwise we lose the argument. If we let that go, then we have no argument. And I would argue that that is a stronger case than sort of singling out individuals. I mean, we're not looking for special rights for anyone. We're looking for equal rights. I think that's the key to our fight back.
I think also just you go first, Kieran.
Just to say, it's brilliant to see Proinsias de Rossa here today, because Proinsias was one of our crucial supporters, again at a time when we had very few supporters. And Proinsias was in the Dáil and elsewhere was, you know, a huge, himself and Dick Spring were harriers of Fianna Fáil, and Albert Reynolds, when he was saying they were going to introduce Gaelar from no they're not, and all that kind of stuff. So Proinsias played a crucial role, and also just on it was a very important moment, I think, of solidarity, that Proinsias was the first leader of a political party who marched on Dublin Pride in 1992, I think. So all of us who were on that parade remember that, and I think that was crucially important.
Indeed, and indeed the way around the blockage that existed within Fine Gael at the time. But and I'll take some further ones. One thought occurred to me, and it goes back to the dynamic of those early meetings, Kieran, that you described, where there would have been certain blocks of opposition, and you know, I wouldn't necessarily say they were right wing or always religious. It was fear of the unknown very often, and fear of change, and fear of kind of, you know, that different dynamic coming into the trade union movement. But what in Ireland very often breaks that down is the fact that we're a small country, knowing people. Yeah. So, you know, maybe people would have objected to Connolly Hall being given for that first day, but Cherry was Tyke Philpott's son, you know, or, you know, that at that LGBTQ conference involving a couple of hundred people, having a Kieran Rose standing up and speaking and going to the bar afterwards, and, you know, in the election counts and all of that. It's very hard to other somebody you know, and, you know, in large countries you can more easily other somebody because you're never going to come across them, whereas in a small, more intimate community, it's much harder to hate somebody that you've had a drink with, you know, in that dynamic. And I think that's something that exists in relatively small countries. Sorry to say,
I wanted to thank Kieran for the excellent quality of the presentation, and it reminded me that the it may have coincided with the donation of material by Christopher to the National Library, but that the National Library put up a kind of an illustrated present narrative of the LGBT movement in Ireland. And I just wondered if you were familiar with the circumstances of that occurring, because it's not that often that the National Library has presented a relatively contemporary history in that kind of positive way. And some of us have experience of material going into the National Library and barely being acknowledged or brought to the fore. So that's quite a coup for the movement. And was it Christopher's material, or are you familiar with the donation that was involved?
Sorry, Bill Foley, Christopher is my partner. Christopher had been a keen photographer throughout his life, and hadn't really taken many photographs of early activism, but begun to do so after a trip to Paris with Kieran, in which there was a almost riot outside the Mexican embassy with the police attacking LGBT activists who were engaged in a legitimate protest. And some of those photographs show the police actually physically attacking Kieran. And so that kind of spurred him on to bring the camera henceforth to subsequent Dublin Pride parades. So he documented every Pride in Dublin from '93, which was the year of law reform. It was actually the day after law reform that Pride March happened, and right up until 2007. And for all his effectiveness, Christopher was also a bit of a procrastinator, so he had always intended to donate to the NLI and had kind of put some work into organising the slides over a period of time, but never actually got around to doing it. So after he died, I carried through his wishes to do that. And they set an incredible threshold, like they needed everything to be digitised, to be catalogued, and then that the donation would go in. And they were delighted to accept it, I have to say, because the imagery is really important, you know, and it does tell a story of the LGBT history over time in Dublin, just through the single event of a Pride year on year. And in the donation, I talked to the NLI about hosting an exhibition once they had got it in place, and eventually that did happen just around the time of COVID. So there was a big 6-month exhibition of the photographs Pride, Alive with Pride or Living with Pride is what it was called. So it was very significant that they took it on in the first place, but I think they were also very appreciative to get the material that was so rich and so kind of coherent in its storytelling. So that was a big part of getting them to accept it.
And it's online.
And it's online, so you can still see the exhibition as it was there, but his whole catalogue of about 2,000 photographs is viewable online.
Anybody else? Pat?
Yeah, just to reiterate the points that you made, Shay, I was an activist in the 80s and 90s in the union, and then eventually became an official, right? But I think I remember being in the Ashling Hotel and other places where there was speeches given about being gay, having gay friends, right? And I remember people in audiences or in little pubs and bars who they didn't realise they never met a gay person, right? So, that's what a gay person is like. But I think the other element about unions is that empathy is at the core of what we do. So even someone who's a Fianna Fáil Cumann chair in a small part of the country, who's conservative but cares about pay and conditions, in a union, intolerance doesn't really travel very far, right? So once the debate starts, the culture of unions tends towards solutions, right? So we exist to negotiate, and if a solution is driven by justice as the elemental feature, you can get change, but you still need leaders or the heroes who started off. But like Kieran, but but the places were ready, maybe more so than other people were, for the message. You have to bring this change through because it's not fair not to. That's the debate, as I recall it. It's not fair not to.
I mean, I remember it being a very slow process. I think it's incredible to have this document. Congratulations, Kieran. It's great. I hope you kind of develop it further into a book, which it very much deserves to have as its own material. But I remember after the ICTU statement, there was a sense in which that needed to be spread among individual unions. And as you say, the 1980s were a very depressed time, so there were very few of us who were in work, not mind trade unionised work. And those that were there, we decided that we would bring individual motions to our own trade unions to advance the statement of the ICTU. And we did meet with considerable resistance in the individual trade unions. Firstly, about getting the motions on the AGM, and secondly, in kind of getting it sufficiently supported to be voted through. And so there were significant objections to the point of having gay rights on the agenda of a trade union at the time. And I suppose it's understandable. I mean, as you say, the 1980s were a very depressed time. It seemed to be everything negative happened in that decade. So, I mean, in terms of the average view of LGBT community, what people were seeing was, firstly, gay male activity was criminalised, HIV emerged, so there was a huge stigma on stigma that was happening. So it was very understandable that some resistance would happen. But what was significant about all of those motions, I think, is every single one of them was carried by the individual trade unions. And I think that is a support to the beneficence, I suppose, of the trade union movement in its drive for workers' rights and the acceptance of that as part of workers' rights in the end.
And the little banner at the start saying that gay rights was workers' rights,
Yeah.
framing it like that actually opened the door that mightn't have been as easily opened, you know.
It was interesting that Christopher and myself used to go to the International Lesbian and Gay Association conferences, and what we would go there, we would be talking about the trade unions and as key allies for us. And for a lot of them, that was kind of amazing news, or new, or odd, or strange, or whatever like that. Because it's a weird thing, I think, because a lot of them, you know, in Europe, in the Netherlands and places like that, the lesbian and gay movement was much stronger, had more resources and so on. And so it often ploughed its own furrow, you know, and didn't. And we were always building alliances with the women's movement, the travellers movement, disability movements and stuff like that, as well as the trade unions. And to people from the lesbian and gay movements from other countries, they were surprised by that scene. And then they always think, oh, that's a great idea, we must kind of try that. And just the point about getting support from the trade unions, I often found in over a pint, that kind of thing, where you're talking to people who, as somebody said, you know, who's a Fianna Fáil coming, Cahirdach or whatever, and not necessarily, you know what I mean, they're not culturally supportive of you. But when you frame it by saying that, you know, I'm not really asking you to support me as a gay man, I'm asking you and the union to support me as a worker, and you know that I shouldn't be discriminated against, we shouldn't be treated unfairly, we shouldn't be bullied. And when you put it in that categorization, in that framework, then they immediately, okay, now I got it. You know, that it doesn't mean that you're trying to undermine their Catholic traditional values or their Irish traditional values. All you're talking about is workers' rights, you know, and that is when people say, okay.
And I think that's a wonderful way of putting this conversation to a conclusion. I think it's been the most fruitful conversation. I think it's a wonderful piece of work, because so often these stories can be lost by somebody not getting around to doing it, and then, you know, somebody, instead of giving their stuff to the National Library, puts it in the skip, as so often happens with, you know, the broad records of the movement. I'd just like to thank Kieran for a wonderful presentation. We'll get it up on our website in a little while. Alistair has recorded it, and I'd like to thank everybody for participating. I'd just like to make a small presentation to Kieran of our Labour History and Irish History publication to mark the 50th anniversary of the Society, and as our small way of saying thank you very much for helping us with this talk today.
Thanks very much.